Every evening, someone knocked on the door, but there was never anyone there. Until one day, the door opened. The rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows of his new home should have been soothing, but Mark Foster found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed twice, its deep resonance echoing through the empty rooms of the Victorian mansion he'd purchased for what seemed like a steal. Now, 3 weeks into his stay, he was beginning to understand why the price had been so reasonable. The real estate agent had mentioned the house's unique character and rich history, carefully sidestepping any direct questions about previous owners. Mark hadn't pressed the issue, too enamored with the prospect of escaping the city's relentless pace for the tranquility of rural Massachusetts. The sprawling property, with its weathered shutters and wraparound porch, promised the perfect retreat for finishing his novel. He'd noticed the first anomaly during his third night in the house. The knock came at exactly 2:17 a.m., 3 sharp raps against the solid oak of the front door, spaced with mechanical precision. Mark had rushed downstairs, expecting an emergency or a lost traveler, only to find an empty porch, undisturbed except for the steady fall of autumn leaves. The security cameras he'd installed the next day showed nothing. At 2:17 a.m., the knocking would begin, but the footage revealed only an empty porch, the motion-sensitive lights casting long shadows across weather-worn boards. He'd checked the recordings frame by frame, looking for signs of tampering or technical glitches, but found nothing to explain the nightly disturbance. Local hardware stores began to recognize him as he methodically upgraded the house's security. New locks, reinforced door frames, additional cameras with infrared capabilities, none of it made any difference. The knocking continued, precise as clockwork, 3 distinct raps at 2:17 a.m. Mark started researching the house's history, spending hours at the local library poring over old newspapers and property records. The house had changed hands frequently over the past century, with no owner staying longer than 18 months. Articles mentioned personal reasons for the quick turnovers, but offered no concrete explanations. Sarah Chen, the town's librarian, became an unexpected ally in his investigation. The Martin House, she'd said, using the property's historical name, has always been a subject of local speculation. But if you're looking for ghost stories, you won't find them in official records. I'm not looking for ghost stories, Mark had replied, though the nightly knocking was beginning to shake his skepticism. I just want to understand what's happening. Sarah's dark eyes had studied him with concern. Sometimes understanding comes at a price. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Besides the knocking? He'd hesitated, then told her about the shadows he'd glimpsed from the corner of his eye, the way the temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, and how the old grandfather clock would sometimes stop at 2:17, only to resume ticking moments later as if nothing had happened. There's a local historian, Sarah had offered, writing down a name and address. Augustus Webb. He's eccentric, but he knows more about the house's history than anyone else. Just be careful what questions you ask. Mark found Augustus Webb's house at the end of a gravel road, set back among towering pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural tunnel. The Victorian-era cottage, with its elaborately carved trim and steeply pitched roof, reminded him uncomfortably of his own residence. Webb answered on the first knock, a tall, gaunt man with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. Mr. Foster, Webb said, showing no surprise at the unannounced visit. I've been expecting you. The Martin house always sends its occupants to me eventually. The interior of Webb's home was a labyrinth of books, documents, and artifacts. Glass cases displayed what appeared to be ancient manuscripts, while maps and architectural drawings covered nearly every wall. Webb led Mark to a cluttered study, clearing papers from a leather armchair with practiced efficiency. Before you tell me about the knocking, Webb said, settling behind a massive oak desk, let me tell you about Eleanor Martin. Mark's pulse quickened. In all his research, he'd never encountered that name. Eleanor was the original owner's daughter, Webb continued, pulling out a leather-bound journal. In 1887, she became fascinated with what we'd now call parapsychology, the scientific study of supernatural phenomena. She believed certain mathematical patterns could create bridges between our world and others. What happened to her? Mark asked, noting how Webb's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the journal. She disappeared. After months of conducting what she called temporal resonance experiments, she simply vanished from her locked room. The only evidence was a series of symbols scratched into her desk and a clock that had stopped at 2:17. Mark finished, his mouth dry. Webb nodded grimly. The symbols were eventually translated. They appeared to be instructions for a ritual, though crucial parts were missing. Over the years, various owners have reported finding similar markings throughout the house, often after periods of unusual activity. Mark thought of the strange letter he'd found that morning, filled with arcane symbols. He'd dismissed it as a prank, but now. "Mr. Webb," he said carefully, "what if someone completed the ritual? What would happen then?" Webb's expression darkened. "The Martin house isn't just a house, Mr. Foster. It's a door. And doors can be opened from both sides." On his drive home, Mark's mind raced with questions. He'd come seeking rational explanations and instead found himself deep in a mystery that challenged his understanding of reality. The setting sun cast long shadows across the road, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkening woods. He arrived home to find his front door slightly ajar. The security system showed no signs of tampering, and nothing appeared to be missing. But there, on the antique desk in his study, Eleanor Martin's desk, he now realized, was a fresh set of symbols, still wet as if recently carved. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting down to 2:17 a.m. Mark photographed the symbols and sent them to Sarah, hoping her library resources might help decipher them. While waiting for a response, he methodically searched the house, looking for similar markings. Armed with a flashlight and his phone's camera, he documented everything that seemed out of place: strange scratches around doorframes, odd patterns in the wood grain of the floorboards, and faint etchings in the window glass that only became visible when lit from certain angles. The search led him to a previously overlooked detail: the grandfather clock's pendulum had an intricate pattern engraved on its surface. The design was similar to the symbols he'd found earlier, but with subtle differences. Mark carefully photographed it from multiple angles, then used his laptop to compare it with Eleanor's original markings from Webb's journal. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah: "Don't try to translate them. Coming over. Wait for me." But Mark was already deep into his analysis. The symbols seemed to follow a mathematical pattern, each set building on the previous one. Eleanor's notes had mentioned temporal resonance, and looking at the repeating sequences, Mark began to see what she might have meant. The patterns created a kind of visual rhythm, like music written in an alien notation. The grandfather clock's chime made him jump. He'd lost track of time, it was already 2 a.m. Sarah still hadn't arrived. His phone rang. "Mark." Sarah's voice was breathless. "Listen carefully. I found something in the restricted archives. The symbols aren't just a code, they're coordinates." Eleanor wasn't trying to open a door, she was trying to map something. Something that was already there, moving through the house like a tide. "What do you mean, moving?" "The knocking isn't someone trying to get in, Mark. It's a warning. The house exists in multiple. I don't know how to explain it. Multiple layers of time. The symbols are points where the layers intersect, and 2:17. The call cut off abruptly. Mark tried calling back, but his phone showed no signal. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically, his breath now visible in the air. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed louder, more insistent. 2:15 a.m. He noticed something odd about his earlier photographs of the symbols. In each successive image, the markings appeared slightly different, as if they were shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. He opened the first photo, then the second, comparing them side by side. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. The symbols weren't just changing, they were evolving, completing a sequence. 2:16 a.m. The realization hit him: he hadn't been documenting the symbols, he'd been activating them. Each photograph, each careful observation was part of the process. Eleanor hadn't disappeared during her experiment, she'd succeeded. And now, through his investigation, Mark had unknowingly followed in her footsteps. The grandfather clock's pendulum moved with deliberate slowness, the engraved pattern on its surface now glowing with a faint, bluish light. The temperature continued to drop, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, moving against the natural fall of light. 2:17 a.m. The knocking began, but this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It echoed from every wall, every window, every surface of the house. 3 precise knocks, repeated in a cascade of overlapping rhythms, as if dozens of unseen hands were trying to establish a pattern, to find the right resonance. Mark's investigator's instincts warred with his rising panic. He forced himself to think analytically, even as the knocking intensified. The symbols, the photographs, Eleanor's research, there had to be a pattern, a logic to it all. He pulled out his laptop again, fingers trembling as he arranged the photographs chronologically. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the windows, creating intricate patterns that mimicked the symbols he'd been studying. His breath came in visible puffs as he worked, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision. A sharp crack made him jump. The glass in one of his framed photographs had split, the break forming a pattern that matched part of Eleanor's sequence. As he watched, other frames began to crack in succession, each break adding to the pattern. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, the rhythm matching the sequence of breaking glass. His phone lit up with a text from Sarah, found Webb's notes. Symbols equals anchor points. Eleanor didn't disappear, she's still in the house, but out of sync. Each knock equals attempt to stabilize. Don't let the sequence complete. The grandfather clock's pendulum had stopped, but its hands continued to move, sweeping backward and forward as if searching for something. The glowing pattern on its surface pulsed in time with the knocking, growing brighter with each cycle. Mark's research training kicked in. If the symbols were anchor points, and the knocking was attempting to stabilize something, then the pattern must be building toward a specific configuration. He began photographing the breaking glass, the frost patterns, the moving shadows, documenting everything with methodical precision despite his growing fear. Another text from Sarah: pattern creates temporal convergence. Multiple timelines trying to align. If completed equals permanent overlap. Dangerous. Find Eleanor's original notes. Must break sequence. The knocking had reached a fever pitch, the entire house seeming to vibrate with its rhythm. Mark ran to Eleanor's desk, pulling drawers open frantically. In the last drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom, he found a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Eleanor's cramped handwriting and complex diagrams. As he opened it, a loose page fell out, a letter dated the day of Eleanor's disappearance. The handwriting was shaky but determined. To whoever finds this, the convergence cannot be allowed to complete. The entities I glimpsed between moments, they wait in the spaces where time overlaps, patient and hungry. The knocking is their attempt to establish a frequency that will allow full manifestation. I found a way to disrupt the sequence, but it requires precise timing and... The letter cut off abruptly. Mark looked up to find that the shadows had coalesced into distinct shapes, moving with deliberate purpose now. The knocking had changed pitch, becoming deeper, more resonant, as if emerging from somewhere vast and distant. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see lights moving in the darkness outside, not flashlights or car headlights, but soft, bluish glows that seemed to float at odd angles, ignoring the normal rules of perspective. They pulsed in time with the knocking, growing brighter and closer with each cycle. The grandfather clock's hands spun wildly now, and in their blur, Mark caught glimpses of other times, daylight streaming through windows that had been dark moments before, furniture rearranging itself, wallpaper peeling and repairing in seconds. The layers of time that Sarah had mentioned were becoming visible, bleeding into one another like watercolors on wet paper. His phone buzzed again. Sarah, web missing. Found his research. Eleanor created failsafe. Look for pattern interruption in clock mechanism. Hurry. Mark turned to the grandfather clock, studying it with renewed intensity. The glowing pattern on the pendulum wasn't just decoration, it was a mathematical sequence, similar to but subtly different from the other symbols. Eleanor's notes had mentioned a way to disrupt the sequence. Could the clock itself be the key? The shapes in the shadows were more defined now, suggesting human figures moving in ways that hurt his eyes to track. The knocking had developed an almost musical quality, the overlapping rhythms creating harmonies that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Through the temporal distortions, Mark caught a glimpse of someone working at Eleanor's desk, a young woman in Victorian dress, writing frantically by candlelight. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met across the gulf of time. She mouthed something urgently, pointing at the clock, but before he could understand, the image faded. Mark forced himself to focus on the clock's mechanism. The pendulum's pattern was incomplete, he realized, missing elements that appeared in the other symbols. Not a flaw in the design, but an intentional omission. Eleanor hadn't just left a warning, she'd left a tool. The floating lights outside had reached the windows, their cold radiance revealing impossible geometries in the glass. The frost patterns were moving now, growing and changing like living things. Through the windows, Mark could see other versions of his house superimposed on each other, the original Victorian mansion, a burnt-out shell from some forgotten fire, an overgrown ruin, all existing simultaneously. His phone lit up one last time, pattern in clock equals reversal sequence. Complete it. Use photos as reference. Careful, one chance. The symbols in his photographs were still shifting, but now he understood they were showing him what was missing from the pendulum's pattern. With trembling hands, he retrieved a pen from Eleanor's desk. The pendulum's surface was cool under his fingers as he began to draw, adding the missing elements while the house shuddered around him. The knocking reached a crescendo, the overlapping rhythms achieving a harmony that made reality itself seem to vibrate. Through the temporal distortions, Mark saw other figures now, previous owners of the house, each caught in their own investigation of the mystery. Some were writing, some were photographing, some were drawing symbols of their own. All of their actions were converging on this moment, this attempt to either complete or break the sequence. Among them, he glimpsed Augustus Webb, looking both younger and older than when Mark had met him, his face illuminated by the same otherworldly light that now filled the house. Their eyes met briefly, and Webb nodded in grim understanding before his image faded like all the others. The shadows had almost completely coalesced now, forming shapes that suggested doorways opening onto spaces that couldn't exist in normal geometry. Through them, Mark caught glimpses of what waited between moments, things that Eleanor had seen, that had driven her to create her failsafe. As he completed the final symbol on the pendulum, time seemed to stutter. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. In that moment of absolute stillness, Mark saw Eleanor clearly, not as a temporal echo or ghostly apparition, but as a woman caught between moments, her face showing both determination and fear. She stood before one of the shadow doorways, her hand raised as if frozen in the act of reaching for something. Around her neck hung a pendant that matched the pattern Mark had just completed on the pendulum. Her lips moved, and this time he could hear her words, though they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The resonance must be broken," she said, her voice distorted as if traveling across vast distances. "They found the frequency that connects all moments, all possibilities. They want to collapse them into one, a single moment they can fully enter. The knocking is their key, their way of establishing the pattern. Breaking it is our only defense." The house groaned, timbers creaking as reality tried to reassert itself. The shadows writhed, their almost formed doorways beginning to waver. Through them, Mark caught glimpses of other investigators, not just past owners, but future ones as well, all connected by their pursuit of the truth, all part of the same endless investigation. He saw Sarah in multiple timelines, discovering crucial documents, warning different versions of himself, slowly piecing together the puzzle that Eleanor had left behind. He saw Augustus Webb at different ages, his obsession with the house's mystery spanning decades, perhaps centuries. The grandfather clock's mechanism had begun to move again, but differently now. The pendulum swung in a new rhythm, its pattern glowing with increasing intensity. The symbols Mark had added were changing the frequency, disrupting the harmony that the entities had tried to establish. But something was wrong. The shadow doorways weren't closing, they were changing, adapting to the new pattern. The knocking resumed, but inverted somehow, following the pendulum's new rhythm. What he'd thought was a solution was becoming part of the problem. It was never about stopping them, Eleanor's voice came again, clearer now. It's about maintaining the balance. The space between moments must be preserved, or all of time will collapse. The house sits at a nexus, a point where realities intersect. We're not its owners, Mr. Foster. We're its guardians. The revelation hit Mark with stunning clarity. Every investigation, every attempt to solve the mystery, had been part of a larger pattern. The house didn't need to be fixed or exorcised, it needed to be maintained, kept in careful balance between stability and chaos. The knocking changed again, finding a new harmony with the pendulum's rhythm. But this time, instead of trying to break it, Mark listened. In the complex overlap of sounds, he began to understand what Eleanor had discovered, a mathematical poetry that described the architecture of time itself. Sarah burst through the front door, clutching a stack of papers, Webb's missing research. She froze at the threshold, taking in the scene, the temporal distortions, the shadow doorways, Mark standing by the grandfather clock with Eleanor's pattern glowing on the pendulum. The symbols, she gasped, holding up Webb's papers. They're not just a language, they're a maintenance log. Every owner who investigated, everyone who documented the phenomena, we were all maintaining the balance without knowing it. Webb figured it out years ago, but he knew publishing the truth would disrupt the pattern. The temporal distortions were stabilizing now, settling into a rhythmic pulse that matched the pendulum's swing. The shadow doorways remained, but they no longer seemed threatening, they were more like the house's breathing, a necessary exchange between moments that kept the temporal architecture intact. Mark noticed something else in the shadows, glimpses of future investigators, carrying out their own research, adding their own observations to the endless log. He saw himself among them, at different ages, studying different aspects of the phenomenon. The house hadn't chosen its owners randomly, it had selected them for their curiosity, their dedication to understanding. What happens now? He asked, both to Sarah and to Eleanor's lingering presence. Now you begin the real work, Eleanor's voice came, fading but still clear. The house must be watched, the balance maintained. The knocking will continue, it's part of the mechanism, a reminder of the schedule that must be kept. Study the patterns. Add to them. But never complete them fully. The space between moments must remain flexible, or reality itself becomes brittle and breaks. Sarah was already setting up her laptop, creating a digital archive of Webb's research. We should document everything, she said, her investigator's instincts taking over. Create a proper system for future guardians. But we have to be careful how we store it, too much explicit information in one place could affect the balance. The grandfather clock struck once, though its hand still pointed to 2:17. The sound rippled through the temporal layers, creating harmonics that made the shadow doorways pulse briefly. Mark understood now why the previous owners had left so quickly, not everyone could handle the responsibility, the constant awareness of time's fragility. But he wasn't going to run. He was an investigator at heart, and this was the ultimate cold case, a mystery that was meant to remain partially unsolved, maintaining its delicate balance between revelation and obscurity. Over the next months, Mark developed a system. He kept detailed notes but scattered them throughout the house, letting future investigators discover them gradually. He learned to recognize the different types of knocking, understanding them as status reports from the house's temporal mechanics. Sarah became a regular visitor, helping him catalog the phenomena while maintaining the necessary level of uncertainty that kept the system stable. The entities that had tried to force their way through still waited in the spaces between moments, but they were part of the balance now, their attempts to establish resonance absorbed into the larger pattern that kept reality from fracturing. Sometimes, late at night, Mark would catch glimpses of Eleanor working at her desk, or Webb studying the symbols, or future guardians adding their own discoveries to the endless investigation. They were all connected, not just by the house but by their shared dedication to maintaining the mystery that held time itself together. The knocking continued every night at 2:17, but Mark no longer rushed to answer it. Instead, he documented each variation, adding his observations to the complex tapestry of notes and symbols that spanned centuries. He had become part of something larger than himself, a network of investigators spread across time, each contributing to a mystery that could never be fully solved, only carefully maintained. And in the end, that was the real answer to the case: some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be preserved, protected, and passed on to the next guardian who would take up the endless investigation.